Much has been said about Ottawa's public transportation system, especially regarding the light rail train or LRT. The list of problems from stage one range from benign to dangerous, from door faults to construction delays, notices of default, train closures for many weeks, lowered criteria to pass safety testing, derailments, and even multiple sinkholes. But why weren't the City of Ottawa, OC Transpo, and Rideau Transit Group, or RTG, able to deliver Stage 1 on time and on budget for $2.1 billion? Ultimately, it was due to an ill-conceived budget that was politically motivated, a very flawed procurement process, a public-private partnership, P3, that created hostile business relationships, new, unproven technologies that were not ready to go to market, a lack of transparency, pressure to deliver leading to lower safety standards, and most importantly, no accountability for city officials, especially Mayor Jim Watson, City Manager Steve Canadianalysis, General Manager of Transportation Services Department John Manconi, and the Chair of the Transit Commission, Alan Hubley. But why should we look into this particular project? Well, Stage 1 of the LRT was the largest transportation infrastructure project in Ottawa since the construction of the Rideau Canal in the early 19th century. And Global Infrastructure Hub argues that government investment in infrastructure generates 50% more economic output than other types of public spending. So it makes sense that the city would be willing to undertake such a big project. Government officials are quick to point out that Ottawa is the capital of a G7 country, with Canada being one of the most desirable and forward-looking places in the world. But here's my main takeaway. We were not able to build a 12.5-kilometer train system that worked properly. The keys were handed over 16 months after the deadline, and it wasn't functional at that point. The project ran at least $500 million over budget. The exact figure is unknown due to ongoing litigation, and the trains don't work if there's freezing rain or it's too hot outside. How can Canada claim to be a serious country if it can't build a basic transportation system right next to Parliament? What's more, Stage 1 pales in comparison to Stage 2. If you look at the map on the screen, only a small portion represents Stage 1. A thicker red line connects Tunney's Pasture to Blair, while the rest of the colored lines represent Stage 2. And if you think that the finances don't make sense for Stage 1, I have news for you. The finances for Stage 2 are absolutely horrifying and dysfunctional. The irony, of course, is that Canada would not exist if we were not able to build a railway across the country. Our national motto is Amari Usque Amare, or from sea to sea. As historian George Stanley wrote, without railways, there would be and could be no Canada. And yet, over 150 years after Confederation, we failed to build a 12.5-kilometer train system in the nation's capital. I find it embarrassing, but I would prefer to dig into the details rather than ignore the problem. To truly understand the scope of the LRT debacle, it's best to examine the past, present, and future. Let's start with the Transitway. To learn about the origins of the LRT, I summarized an article from the Transportation Research Board, the board, called Bus Rapid Transit, Volume 1, Case Studies in Bus Rapid Transit, or BRT. The board is an American NGO that aims to mobilize expertise, experience, and knowledge to anticipate and solve complex transportation-related challenges. Published in November 2003, this extensive analysis covers the experiences of 26 urban centers, including those of Ottawa, Vancouver, and 12 American cities. Here are some relevant excerpts for Ottawa. The Ottawa Transitway system, perhaps the most comprehensive system in North America, is an outgrowth of the 1974 official plan. The 60-kilometer Transitway system includes 26 kilometers of bus-only roadway, with most of the remaining distance on reserved freeway or arterial lanes. Importantly, speeds on the Transitway and reserved freeway lanes range up to 80 kilometers per hour. The report continued, under current conditions, average operating speeds, including stops, are 50 kilometers per hour. By contrast, the The LRT was supposed to run from Blair to Tunney's Pasture, or 12.5 kilometers, in fewer than 25 minutes. But due to wheel bearing problems, that trip takes about 30 minutes, or an average speed of 25 kilometers an hour, 50% slower than by BRT. Now, what else is there to know about Ottawa's Transitway, the system that preceded its LRT? I think it bears repeating that even in 1974, the Transitway was designed with the idea that it could eventually be transformed into an LRT. However, the board noted that the Transitway in 2003 had a large capacity, moved passengers quickly, and saved on additional expenses. Let's break down the 2003 numbers. There were approximately 200,000 weekday riders, about 180 to 200 buses entering the downtown in each direction during peak hours, about 9,000 to 10,000 one-way passengers, and more than half of the people who would travel into Ottawa's downtown core, including 70% of the people who worked there, would arrive by bus. There were two main transitway routes, 95 and 97, that provided rapid transit-like service. These were complemented by peak hour express routes and local feeder buses. Stopping at each station, the 95 and 97 operated 22 hours daily from 4:30 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. They ran on a 4-minute peak headway and 5 to 6-minute off-peak headway using articulated buses. The Transitway had reduced the need for additional buses. Without the Transitway, OC Transpo would have required an additional 150 buses to carry the same number of passengers. The reasoning behind a 1976 study recommended buses because they could circulate through the suburbs, pick up riders, and then enter the Transitway for a fast run downtown, and this was especially true for express buses. On the other hand, a rail-based system would have required one or more transfers, which is certainly the case today. Before even getting into stage one of the LRT, I must highlight a presentation from Edward Conway, a lawyer in Ottawa. It's called the 2014 Cost-Benefit Analysis of the LRT Financing Structure, fun, and it was made in the context of the Ottawa municipal election in 2014. In the presentation, Mr. Conway questions the claims that an LRT uses clean energy, produces density, and limits car usage, specifically in North America. Quote, "None of these results actually occur in North American LRT cities because the natural density is too low to produce high ridership. The geography of North American cities still induces car use regardless of LRT. There has never been any appreciable mode switch in any North American LRT city. There has never been any reduction in car use in any North American LRT city. The green benefits, which are dependent upon mode switch, do not occur. The LRT was conceived in Ottawa to address a perceived slowdown because of predicted transitway congestion in 2019. OC Transpo demand predictions, upon which this capacity rationale for the LRT are based, tend to be overstated. Demand predictions by transit authorities tend to be overstated. This is especially so in North American cities where transit authorities were trying to promote LRT systems." He continued, "Ottawa's density, at 196 people per square kilometer, is the lowest density in the world for any major city. It means that the LRT will not be reasonably self-sufficient financially in Ottawa. The LRT will not pay for itself from fare revenue. The LRT will not generate any significant increase in ridership because of the low city density." I believe that Mr. Conway mentioned several important facts that were not fully considered at the onset of the LRT project, Stage 1. With those in mind, let's move on to Stage 1. Now, Stage 1 of the LRT was so flawed that the Government of Ontario ordered that a full inquiry be carried out. And as much as I would love to go over every point of the 664-page document, I will only highlight the most important aspects of it. However, feel free to read the entire inquiry here. It's important to note that I provide many details for the initial budget because it informs other aspects that help explain mistakes that were made along the way. According to the Government of Ontario's report of the Ottawa Light Rail Transit Public Inquiry, the $2.1 billion fixed price for Stage 1 of the LRT was based on an initial estimate that city staff provided to Council in 2009. It did not account for inflation, had a variance of plus or minus 25%, and was never intended to be an actual budget. In his run for office in 2010, Mayor Jim Watson promised that the train would be on time and on budget, but to use such an unreliable figure would go against the public interest. Importantly, former city treasurer Marian Similik confirmed that the city would go on to use an affordability cap, meaning that the winning bid would need to be at or under the $2.1 billion mark. When asked for examples of how the city would try to save and absorb the extra costs, Similik explained that the answer was value engineering. The tunnel underneath downtown was not as deep, and the U-Ottawa station was supposed to be underground, but was switched to above ground in order to save on costs. In addition, platform doors were excluded from the design due to budgetary constraints. These platform doors would have prevented riders on the platform from interfering with the vehicle doors, an activity that contributed to early reliability issues during public service. In other words, the city was willing and did cut corners to strive for the original budget. For the record, this was the project estimate presented in 2009. Rob Pattinson, who headed the LRT division for the provincial agency Infrastructure Ontario, confirmed that the budget was not up for debate and was concerned that this could lead to a failed procurement. In the public inquiry, the authors indicated 3 mistakes related to the budget. 1. The $2.1 billion figure was never meant to be a budget, and former Deputy City Manager for Planning and Infrastructure until 2014, Nancy Scheppers, stated that it would be irresponsible to use the estimate given in late 2009 as a budget. Unfortunately, that's exactly what Jim Watson did. 2. The city's senior staff and independent experts expected the $2.1 billion figure to change as the engineering and design work was completed, but Mayor Watson's mandate turned that expectation on its head. Rather than the budget changing to meet the best design, the design would change to meet the budget. The report continued. It went beyond general oversight of budget and straight into interference for political purposes. Although the mayor and council were rightly involved in managing the city's budget, they did not have the expertise necessary to determine when and how the budget for this specific project should be fixed. This was also true for the project schedule, with the city's experts suggesting that the LRT could open in 2019, and Jim Watson pressuring consultants to accelerate the timeline to launch by Canada's 150th in July 2017. In the end, Stage 1 launched in September 2019, and it wasn't truly functional at that point. Here's the project timeline that the city experts presented in 2011. Procurement process and P3 model. I've spoken extensively about the pressures on the initial budget, which obviously factor into the procurement process and selection of the P3 model. In the interest of time and simplicity, I would refer you back to the inquiry for the full analysis of the procurement and P3 model, but here are 3 important points. While the P3 model can transfer risk to the private entity, that comes at a significant cost through risk premiums. It also limits the public's entity's involvement in the project, so it has less oversight and control. Notably, here's a direct quote from the inquiry. On high-profile projects, even when responsibility and risks are transferred contractually to the private sector, governments will often be held responsible in the public eye for delays or service that falls below expected standards. What do you think happened in Ottawa? On the topic of private sector innovation, when design, construction, maintenance, and/or operations are bundled into a single contract, it is supposed to create creative tensions between separate project functions to deliver a good product at the lower price. The only caveats are that the public entity can be too prescriptive and the private entity is financially incentivized to cut costs and maximize profits. And finally, if you enter into a construction agreement as well as a 30-year maintenance agreement with one private company, you inherit all the potential benefits and risks of dealing with one provider. new, unproven technologies. This point is so straightforward that I feel silly saying it out loud, but here goes. All things being equal, proven technology is much more reliable than unproven technology. The City of Ottawa agreed with that perspective at the beginning of the process and strongly recommended using proven vehicles. However, the city ultimately went forward with Alstom's Citadis Spirit model, which included existing components from other train models, but was actually a new custom-built vehicle for this project. Further, the city demands for the vehicle pushed the limits of performance for an LRT. They were essentially gambling on the ability of RTG to deliver this new vehicle, and that was subcontracted to Alstom, which had no relationship to the city. Additionally, they were never able to test the trains in the Ottawa winters due to issues with the project schedule. Ottawa took one for the team, according to a city consultant, and other cities could benefit from Ottawa's growing pains with a new vehicle. How magnanimous and fiscally irresponsible. Lack of transparency and pressure to deliver, especially in the testing phase. I want to emphasize the importance of testing and the extent to which related shortcuts compromise the reliability of the LRT and the public trust in the transportation system. Just like when city officials were pressured into working within the $2.1 billion framework, the testing phase of the LRT strayed into interference for political purposes. Here's a direct quote from the inquiry. It is clear from the evidence that everyone knew or should have known that there would be significant reliability issues with the system. End quote. The inquiry continued. City staff became willing to compromise to get the system into operation and agreed to defer work, waive requirements, and delay addressing known problems. It is evident that the decision to compromise was based on political pressure and not on the best interests of the people of Ottawa. Once again, the details of the testing phase are staggering, but here are 4 key points. The first 3 days of testing showed that there were significant reliability problems, and although they had to be 12 consecutive days of testing originally, they broke up the testing period to only count the days that would pass inspection. The city and RTG were both aware that they were unable to deliver 17 double-car trains as promised, so they lowered the requirement to 13 double-car trains. There is no dispute that the full information on the testing results and the city's decision to lower testing standards was not shared with council. However, this critical information was provided on a regular basis to Mayor Watson, several members of his staff, and Councillor Alan Hubley, the chair of the Transit Commission, through a WhatsApp chat group. Any doubt about whether Manconi was prepared to interfere in order to obtain favorable test results was removed when he and his staff negotiated an agreement with RTG, confirmed by a letter dated August 16, 2019, to lower testing standards to the 2017 criteria. The system was then able to pass the reduced testing standards, but even on some of the days of trial running that received a pass, the scores indicated that there would be significant disruptions for riders. Mayor Watson was in constant contact with Manconi during this period and was advised about the ongoing problems and the decision to lower the testing standards. You may be asking yourself, what happened to the people who were in charge of Stage 1 of the LRT? Let's break it down. Jim Watson, mayor. He stepped down as mayor in late 2022 and now keeps a low public profile. After no longer having access to a salary of $200,000, he was given a severance of $100,000. He also volunteers regularly. In a February 2024 article with the Ottawa Citizen, he said, "I take responsibility for the system because politicians will be taking credit for when it goes well, and you're going to take the criticism when it's not working well." He continued, "I appreciate the public's anger and frustration." Ultimately, the leader of the organization has to take responsibility. You're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't take responsibility, people will say, "Why aren't you taking responsibility?" If you do, They said, well, what does that mean? You can't win, except I still believe we needed that system. We now have capacity of 24,000 people an hour through the downtown core, which will serve us well into the next 30 to 40 years. We'll have that kind of capacity because we have the train system that was planned for the future, not for today. And I have to highlight something. It's not true that we have a capacity of 24,000 people per hour. That's the theoretical capacity if we extend the platforms and also add on more cars to the trains. So we currently have double trains, and going every 5 minutes, we have the capacity to bring people, I think it's 7,133 people per hour downtown. And we could increase that to 10,700 people if we go back to the 2019 train service of every 3 minutes and 20 seconds. So to say that we currently have 24,000, the capacity of 24,000 people per hour is simply untrue. It's a theoretical number, and it would take a lot of renovations and organization by the city of Ottawa to expand the platforms and as well as build more trains to have that available. Moving on. Steve Canadianalysis, city manager. Steve Kay became city manager in 2016 and announced a sudden retirement 2 days before the LRT inquiry was published in November 2022. He had worked at the City of Ottawa for almost 38 years, but his immediate resignation meant that he would not have to comment or answer questions on the LRT inquiry report's findings. Unfortunately, Steve Kay had to say goodbye to his annual salary of nearly $400,000, but the good news is that he was able to retire with a full pension and no accountability regarding the LRT. He now keeps a low profile online. John Manconi, General Manager of Transportation Services Department. As a refresher, Manconi apologized to council in 2020 for not properly informing them that the city had paid RTG $4.5 million. A CBC story that reported the payment came as a shock to some councillors. And in March 2021, CBC reported that SNC-Lavalin had told the city that it is expecting to be at least 4 months late finishing the extension of the Trillium line, information not shared with councillors. In 2022, his salary was approximately $300,000. And do you remember when I said that critical information was provided on a regular basis to Mayor Watson, several members of his staff, and Councillor Alan Hubley, the chair of the Transit Commission, through a WhatsApp chat group? During the public inquiry in June 2022, as it turns out, Manconi didn't mention the existence of the WhatsApp messages during his interview with Commission lawyers when asked if he had given Mayor or City Manager daily updates during the LRT's trial run. He then said that he forgot to mention the group chats. Coincidentally, John Manconi started collecting his full pension in October 2021, after he retired in September 2021, and started working at STV, a consultant firm that provided services to the City of Ottawa for Stage 1 of the LRT. According to his LinkedIn profile, he continues to work at STV as the Senior Vice President, Transportation Program Services. Although he has not accepted my invitation to connect on LinkedIn, I wish him well. Alan Hubley, Chair of the Transit Commission. First elected in 2010, Alan Hubley is currently serving his 4th consecutive term as City Councillor for Ward 23, Canada South. Horizon Ottawa began circulating a petition calling for Hubley's resignation in late 2022, but nothing came of it. But what about Stage 2? Earlier, I mentioned that the finances for Stage 2 are absolutely horrifying and dysfunctional, but there are several reasons for that. When the Stage 2 expansion was pitched to residents, they were told it would be funded by equal contributions from the municipal, provincial, and federal governments. By February 22nd, 2019, before Stage 1 was even completed, the cost of Stage 2 ballooned to nearly $4.7 billion, more than $1 billion over the original budget of $3.6 billion. And it was announced that it would take 2 years longer to complete than originally planned. That delay has since been extended. This meant that the original promises of $1.2 billion per level of government for a total of $3.6 billion would not cover the cost of the project. And you might be asking yourself, what would the final bill be for the City of Ottawa, and what's the total capital cost for Stage 2? I can tell you that by November 17, 2023, the bill had grown to $4.91 billion, with the city being responsible for 51% rather than 33%. However, by June 25th, 2024, City Council gave the go-ahead to settle outstanding legal claims over the construction of Stage 2 of the LRT, but the public would not know how much they would cost, who would pay, or even which of the east, west, or south extensions of the LRT they would cover. We did know that the payments were costly enough that the city asked the federal and provincial governments to help pick up the tab. So we don't know how much the construction cost is or will be for Stage 2, but there's a very good chance that conservatively it's over $5 billion, with the original budget having been touted at $3.6 billion. So much for transparency and lessons learned during Stage 1. Nonetheless, we haven't talked about the operational costs yet. Apparently, OC Transpo ran a deficit of $29 million in 2023, but it was largely offset by the $27.8 million in efficiencies, also known as service cuts. But from 2025 to 2028, Ottawa predicts that the deficits will be $120, $131, $145, and $150 million, respectively. Written by Randall Denley in August 2024, this article goes on to praise Mayor Sutcliffe for seeking more money from the federal government. While that may partially solve the cash flow issue, it doesn't address the question of efficiency. Do you remember when I cited that 2003 study discussing how efficient the BRT was and how quickly the city was able to move people? I think this is a great time to examine what was promised and what was delivered for the LRT, as well as use the 2003 BRT numbers to put things into context. All right, let's look at some numbers. In terms of service frequency during peak hours, in 2003, the BRT came every 4 minutes. In 2019, so LRT Stage 1, the train was able to come every 2 or 3 minutes. That's what was promised anyways. In 2025, this is LRT Stage 1 and Stage 2, it's every 5 minutes for Line 1, so that's from Blair to Tenny's Pasture. And there's also Line 2 and Line 4. They both come every 12 minutes. In terms of capacity, in 2003, the BRT could handle 20,900 passengers, assuming 110 passengers per bus, and assuming that there are 190 buses. In the transit study, it said there were between 180 and 200 buses, so I took the average of that. In 2019, Stage 1 of the LRT, there were up to 10,700 passengers per hour, and in 2025, there were 7,133 passengers per hour. This is because in 2019, the assumption was that a train passed every 3 minutes and 20 seconds, but in 2025, it's every 5 minutes. And we're just talking about on-peak here because off-peak is a separate thing. One thing that I wanted to show you is Table 8, which is a comparison of selected busway and LRT ridership. I think this is relevant because it shows the amount of passengers moved per kilometer in Ottawa compared to other cities. So in Ottawa, with the BRT, they were able to move over 6,000 passengers per hour, per kilometer, sorry. And if you look at the other options for LRT, you could see that they're much lower. It's worth noting, by the way, that Buffalo was a complete failure in its transition to the LRT system. So you could read up on that if you want. But you can clearly see that the BRT actually moves quite a bit of people per kilometer. So that's a good thing. Moving on, let's talk about weekday passengers. In 2003, the BRT moved 200,000 people per hour on peak. In 2019, it was approximately 300,000, and 2025, over 200,000, which is the best number I could find for both. Basically, the statistic that I found for 2025 was found on an article on OC Transpo's website saying that we move over 200,000 people per hour. per weekday, sorry. And then in 2019, assuming that we have lost 33% of the ridership, which is the case, we're only at 66% of what it was before the pandemic. That means that we were moving approximately 300,000 in 2019. Let's talk about the airports a little bit. Now, to take line 4 from the airport to South Keys, it takes 7 minutes. From South Keys to Bayview on line 2, it takes 21 minutes. And on line 1 from Bayview to Parliament Station, 6 minutes. So according to the OC Transpo Planner, it says that it takes 51 minutes to get from the airport to Parliament Station. Now, if you have to take the replacement bus for line 1, called R1, to go from Bayview to Parliament Station, it takes 18 minutes. And I included this because there are often issues with the LRT, and there are replacement buses that serve to, replace their function, as it was the case last weekend. So to get from the airport to Parliament Station by lines 4, 2, and R1, it takes an hour and 3 minutes. So one thing I'd like to point out is that the board said that by taking the old 97 in 2003, it took approximately 20 minutes to get to Parliament Station from the airport. So conservatively, it takes 2.5 times longer now with the trains, and it will continue to be that way because if you remember, lines 2 and 4 only pass every 12 minutes, and line 4 actually only goes between the airport and South Keys Station, and there's only one track, and it's only one train that moves you. So that's why it's never going to be faster unless they were to build a second railway. I doubt it. By the way, Laura Dudas, City Councillor for Ward 2, Orleans West Innes, wrote an article on January 2nd, 2025, called Rail Link to Ottawa Airport is the Real Game Changer. In said article, she discusses how a direct link between the airport and city centre is vital to developed countries, especially in capital cities such as London, Amsterdam, and Paris. She uses the term direct and continuous link to describe the route that I just mentioned, that of 3 different trains. Using lines 4, 2, and 1 takes 51 minutes, and the old 97, which did not require transfers, took 20 minutes. And that's one of the main reasons why I made this video. I wanted to document exactly how public transportation worked in Ottawa in the past, how it works now, and how it might work in the future. The north-south extension could be considered to have improved the feel of airport transfers to downtown, but without spending the extra money on integrating lines 2 and 4, because the trains and railways aren't compatible, it was always going to take much longer. And this was flawed from the start. So no, to claim that this new route is a direct and continuous link seems disingenuous at best, but simply untrue when compared to OC Transpo's previous option in the 97. Prior to being elected to City Council in 2018, Laura had worked in communications at the City of Ottawa since approximately 2011, so I doubt that she was unaware of the bus service that existed beforehand. So where does that leave us? Well, Ontario has just gone to elections, and both the Conservatives and Liberals have promised that Metrolinx, a provincial crown corporation, would take over control of the LRT from the City of Ottawa. However, that won't fix things like cash flow issues in a real business sense, because the $4 fares, which is one of the highest in Canada, will still have to be subsidized one way or the other. So currently, it's either done through fares or through property tax. And this was decided in the late 90s in Ontario that this is how fares would be collected. Before there were other options, I guess. But all of the announcements that the government of Ontario has made so far regarding giving more money to the City of Ottawa has been through capital costs, not operational costs. That's a big difference because ultimately you do have like a final bill for capital cost at some point. Let's say all the litigation is settled. Well, then you'll know how much you have spent. But operational costs are ongoing because it's how much it costs to make sure the thing works from year to year. With the deficits that I mentioned, clearly something has to give. It's either that there's more money coming in through ridership or one level of government, or service has to be cut one way or the other. Now, the public inquiry brought to light a lot of important information regarding the LRT and the bad decisions that were made along the way. It also brought about 100 recommendations to the City of Ottawa, but it is not a judicial inquiry. So the people who made the important decisions, especially the bad ones, will not be held responsible unless something happens in the future. This isn't to say that the public inquiry was useless. In fact, I really appreciated how thorough the document was, and I did read through most of it and tried to summarize it as best I could. Part of the reason why I made this video is because I wanted to make the information as digestible as possible in video format, because I know there's almost no one that's going to read a document like that, and also cross-reference it with a lot of articles and find a BRT study from 2003 from some US board. But the truth is, I think that this video, for me, is a way to document what happened in the past and about where we are now, what could happen in the future. I didn't speculate too much on the next stages of the LRT, but I will say that the former mayor, the former city manager, the former head of the Transit Commission Committee, and the former head of Transit are ultimately not responsible if you look at like fiscally what happened here. It seems as though John Manconi could just go on to have a career working for the contractor in which he was working with at the City of Ottawa. Jim Watson retired, and Steve Kay retired, and then Alan Hubley is still an elected official for the City of Ottawa. If I could say something to a representative of the government of Ontario, it would actually be thank you for doing this public inquiry. Consider doing a judicial one as well, because I don't think that the lessons here should be forgotten. And I think that there should actually be consequences for elected officials and top bureaucrats. These people make between $200,000 and $400,000 a year, which is fine. It's actually a lot of responsibility. I believe I read that if you're in charge of the city, you have 17,000 employees, give or take. So maybe that does justify a salary of $400,000. But when you make such big decisions that impacts Ottawa residents, and it does reflect the country of Canada as a whole, I think you should be held accountable in one way or another. Lastly, this video, for me, was a passion project. It honestly took me about 40 to 50 hours of research and rewriting the script so that I can make a coherent video on this topic. It was very difficult. It was more work than I expected, but I'm not really looking to dig deeper in the LRT unless something else comes up. But I do really appreciate if you would like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I do intend on making more videos analyzing very Canadian topics. The next one I'm going to make is going to be a lot less research heavy because this was ridiculous, and I have to plan out more time in the future for that. Thank you so much for watching. Please share the video if you think it was useful in some way, and I hope it's not too long. I really tried to make it as concise as possible, and I know we're about like half an hour, maybe a bit more than that at this point. So thanks so much. My name's Sidock, and I'll see you next time.